Okie doke. So we now know how to set up our null and research hypotheses. So let's take a look at something that we've kind of already been doing for the last couple of videos. Operationalization and working with variables. Operationalization simply means that we choose what we're talking about. So let's try this. What is happiness? How do you measure happiness? I'd like to once again ask you, pause the video, I'll give you 3 seconds to do so, and come up with different ways to measure happiness. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so what did you come up with? So some examples on how we could measure happiness would be, say, count the number of smiles people make in a given day. Or we could count how many times they laugh. We could measure happiness in terms of the friends that they have, or we could measure happiness in terms of the dopamine in their brain, a chemical that is related to how happy people feel. We could measure happiness in terms of how excited they are. We could just ask them, how happy do you feel on a scale from 1 to 7? There are many, many ways that we could operationalize happiness. But whatever way we choose is perfectly fine as long as we've told you what we mean when we're talking about happiness. Because we deal with very abstract things in psychology and sometimes very opinion based things in psychology, we have to figure out a way to be objective and consistent. And the way we do that is by operationalization and accountability, telling people how we operationalized things. So, just to reiterate, operationalization is to choose what specific operational definitions we have in our research. And an operational definition is just how we defined something. So you could define happiness in a lot of different ways. It's very important when you're doing research into happiness that you tell people how you measured happiness. And whatever way you measured happiness is probably okay as long as it makes sense, uh, although it's not a bad idea to provide a reason for why you operationalized things the way that you did. So we've already tried the question, how might you operationalize happiness? So let's try this again. I'll give you 3 seconds once more, but this time what I'd like you to do is see, mm, let's think, how would you operationally define, how about hunger? So think about it. I'll pause for I'll give you 3 seconds to pause the video and come up with your own operational definitions. 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's move on. So we've been talking about variables in the last couple of videos, and I hope that the things that we've talked about have made sense. But let's go ahead and define what we're talking about anyway. A variable is a specific piece of information that you can change. You may remember variables from your high school math classes. For example, in psychology, we may have the variable of eye color, which can have the levels of brown, green, blue, and hazel. Levels being simply different conditions that a variable can have. If you collect weather information every single day, you're probably going to collect data in terms of a couple of different variables like temperature and how cloudy things are, how humid it's been, as well as whether or not it rained or snowed, precipitation. So it's easy to operationalize weather information into some specific measurable variables. And we're going to do that in psychology all the time. We could say that in the previous slides, we were operationalizing happiness into the variables of, say, number of smiles per day, or the self reported 1 to 7 scale for happiness. Now, We've kind of already gone over this slide, so I'll go through it very quickly. Usually when we operationalize stuff, we use a variable to measure a specific idea. So a lot of operationalizing is turning ideas into variables. I already said that. How are you going to measure happiness? How could we operationalize stress into a variable we can measure and work with? Once again, I'll give you 3 seconds to come up with an operationalized variable for stress. 3, 2, 1. All right, so we have a couple more types of variables that we can work with, or a couple different ways that we can talk about our variables. Here we've got independent versus dependent variables. You again probably remember this from science in previous grades, but to cover it once more, an independent variable is a variable that you can manipulate or make comparisons on, and a dependent variable is one that you would measure based off of that previous thing. Other classes have sometimes called the independent variable the predictor variable and the dependent variable the predicted variable, because you'll often look at them in those terms. For example, if you're trying to find out, okay, does your favorite color affect the number of shirts you own? You would gather data from a lot of different people, and you would check, well, what are their favorite colors, and see whether they're related to how many shirts they own of those other different colors. So because because the color that you think is related to the number of shirts you own is your favorite color, that would be an independent variable, and your dependent variable would be the quantity of shirts. Note that the favorite color variable, the independent variable, is a set of groups, whereas the dependent variable here is a number. That's going to be the case in many situations, but that's not always true, and we'll learn more about that in one of the following sections. It's also important to note that these roles can be flipped. A variable isn't necessarily an independent or dependent variable, except in a specific experiment or research study where you have chosen to make that variable the independent or the dependent variable. So we could have a research question that says, are the shirts that people buy related to their favorite color? And so in that case, the independent variable would be the favorite color, the dependent would be the number of shirts in different colors. But a different way to ask this question might be, do people like colors that they see more often? And so we could say that our independent variable would be the number of shirts they own in the different types of colors, and then the dependent variable would be what their favorite color is. And so we could then flip the roles and see whether or not the quantity of shirts describes the favorite color. One more example here for independent and dependent variables. So in our null hypothesis, or in our hypotheses from before, we said that there is or there is no difference in remembering between told information and Googled information. So the remembering in this case is the dependent variable, whereas the told versus Googled information is the independent variable, because we are checking whether or not being told versus Googling information affects the remembering. And so because this can affect that, so something here is causing something there, or we are choosing / manipulating this information and checking whether it affects this, that makes remembering the dependent and the form of learning to be the independent variable. Another way that we can chop and screw variables is by the way that we measure them. So here are two kind of opposite ways to measure variables. A continuous variable is a variable that you gather or that you measure without individual separation. So you might gather data for a continuous variable just as a set of numbers. Usually when you're talking about continuous data, you're talking about numbers. Next, discrete or categorical variable is one that you gathered or measured in terms of different groups, such as colors. Now, I'd like you to think of a question. Is color really a discrete variable. Yes, we have colors like red versus green versus blue, but if you look at any sort of color wheel, or here we have a color rectangle, there's really no place where there's a distinct difference between red and orange and yellow and green. You can show me vaguely here where the difference is between green and blue. And so if we were working with these colors as categorical or discrete variables, we would say that there's green, there's the green group, and there's the red group. But it's difficult to say that there's any specific place where green is and blue is, whoops, that's not really a great line. That where does blue end and green start? Well, I mean, we could kind of do something like this. Go like, blue's way over here, but it's also kind of over there, and they kind of overlap, but they kind of don't. So the whole point of continuous versus discrete is to say, oh, there is a range of colors, and the colors have different groups, right? Red, orange, yellow. And so here we have a continuous way of describing colors, and here we have a discrete way of describing colors, but we could measure the same thing in different ways. That's not to say that there's no such thing as continuous or discrete, but I will say that just depending on how you choose to operationalize your variable, you're going to have some variables that are continuous and some variables that are discrete, but they could be one way or the other. Let me give you another example. We got a couple more examples of this. So in the real world, remember that we do have discrete and continuous things that we measure. For example, temperature. Can you think of a discrete way to measure temperature? How about it's hot or it's cold? Those are two separate groups. Now, realistically, we know that temperature is on a scale. It's a continuous measure, right? So we could measure temperature in terms of, say, degrees in Fahrenheit. It's 1 degree, it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's a very clear continuous measure because we're measuring it with numbers and because you can have an infinite number of divisions there. It's not as if the temperature 99 and temperature 100 are two different groups, because you can have 99 and a half, you can have 99 and 3/4, you can just keep going down to more specific levels. Now, somewhere in between that discrete and continuous, we could say we could have a 5-point scale. Is it cold, a little cold, room temperature, a little warm, or warm? So we could put that 5-point scale somewhere between discrete and continuous, right? But we're still measuring temperature. Let's give this a shot. Can you come up with different ways you could measure happiness that are discrete, that are continuous, and maybe somewhere in between? I'll give you 3 seconds to pause this video, see if you can work it out in your own head. 3, 2, 1. Okay, well, let's give you some easy examples to point to. You could measure happiness as I'm happy or not happy. That's a very clear, discrete way to measure happiness. Yes or no. You can ask someone, are you happy? Yes or no. A continuous way to measure happiness might be, say, to measure the milligrams of dopamine in their head, or the milliounces, I guess it's a fluid, of dopamine in their head, and count that amount. And you could always divide that into smaller and smaller measurements, so that would be continuous. You could ask someone, on average, how many smiles do you have per day? That's a very continuous measurement because you could have any number of average smiles per day, like 2.5 smiles per day. Some days 3, some days 2, 2.5 on average. Somewhere in between would be, say, How happy are you on a scale from 1 to 5? Or even just um, how often do you smile? Once a day? Once a minute? Once a week? That's somewhere between discrete and continuous. Let's try one more example for this. Now, when people think about students and professors and graduate students, they generally think about those groups of people as being discrete. A student is separate from a graduate student, which is separate from a professor. The thing is that there really isn't as much of a difference there between those groups. What do I mean? Well, I mean, when I became a graduate student, that was just a couple of months after after I stopped being a student, right? And then when I became a professor, that was really only a couple of weeks after I finished being a graduate student. And so for me, it's not as if there was a huge difference in time between those 2 points, right? So it almost feels as though there was no difference between being a student and a graduate student. Just because it seems as though those classifications are categorical doesn't necessarily mean that they can't be continuous. And I'll tell you this right now, pretty much in every single way, every single thing that we could ever measure, there's going to be some sort of continuous way to measure it. And measuring it, there's probably going to be some sort of discrete or categorical way to measure it. But and measuring things in that discrete or categorical way is going to lose some information. So can you think of a continuous way to describe this idea of student, graduate student, and professor? There's a really simple thing. How many hours have you been in school? You measure your what grade you're in, like junior, senior, sophomore, freshman, based on the number of credit hours that you have. Well, graduate students have that number of credit hours. And professors don't really have credit hours, but they have the number of credit hours that they've taught. So it wouldn't be hard to just kind of put that number together and see instead, oh, well, a student has maybe a couple dozen a couple dozen credit hours, a graduate student may have a couple hundred credit hours, and a professor may have probably upwards of a couple thousand credit hours. But really, they are on a big old scale. So, yeah, credit hours is a way to measure this apparently discrete idea. I hope the idea of continuous versus discrete makes sense to you. The practice activities we'll have for this section will be very important. This is something that you are familiar with, that you know, but that maybe you need the vocabulary for, or that you're not used to thinking about. In research, we think about it all the time. Alright, I'll see you in the next video.